Under the 50-year rule, it's just emerged that half a century ago, this country had its very own X-Files. Top secret until now, the records reveal an astonishing number of UFO sightings in Britain's skies. We'll be talking to the RAF pilots who, back in 1953, both witnessed something so strange that the memory burns very bright in their minds to this very day.
And we
went through a prolonged bout of mass hysteria in the 50s that sucked in policemen, fighter pilots and airline crew, or there was a burst of inexplicable activity in the skies above and around Britain. Under the 50-year rule, top-secret government papers are now beginning to emerge, which show that decades before Mulder and Scully, we really did have our very own X-Files, and they were the real deal. All kept under wraps at the time, except for the occasional security lapse, like this one, which surfaced on the fledgling BBC television news one November evening back in 1953, and features in an absorbing Time Watch programme on the subject tonight.
A BBC television news report would cause controversy. The X-Files were about to become top secret. Flying officers Terry Johnson and Geoffrey Smythe had decided to go public with their UFO encounter.
Flying Officer Johnson and Flying Officer Smythe, and Flying Officer Johnson first, tell us exactly what had happened.
Well, the whole story began last Tuesday when we were flying in a Vampire night fighter over Kent and at 20,000 feet, and I first sighted this object. The first sighting was of a tiny pinpoint of bright light. My first impression was that it was a star shining through the overcast, and I looked around to see if there were any more stars, but obviously there weren't. And I continued watching this thing, and for about 15 to 20 seconds it remained stationary, neither moving left or right. After this time, the thing obviously was moving towards us, and before it reached the overhead position, I nudged my navigator, Flying Officer Smythe, to have a look up. By the time it got to the overhead position, it appeared to be moving at quite a fast, fantastic speed, and my impression of it, more or less a photographic impression, was of a round object, quite distinct outline, still with the same intense light, with the maximum light around or towards the periphery of the circle, not quite so intense in the center. The size, the only thing I can compare it with is the sun or the moon, and I had said that the size was approximately half to three-quarters of the size of the moon. Its height, well, there again, I haven't anything to compare it with.
There's no cloud on that day?
No, there's no cloud at all. The visibility was about 100 miles. From where we were, we could actually see the other side of the Isle of Wight.
And what about its speed?
Well, I can't give any indication of speed, as I can't give a true idea of the height. The only thing is I can say that the impression was of an object very much higher above us, and therefore, depending on height, would depend on the speed, but truly has a very fantastic speed in roughly the opposite direction.
Thank you very much. Well, Flying Officer Smythe, can we have your side of the story?
Well, I was rather busy at the time, and I didn't see anything until the pilot told me to look up. And when I looked up, I saw this bright object almost immediately overhead, going in the opposite direction with quite fantastic speed.
And could it have been any sort of meteorological instrument or balloon, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think so. We've gone into this business, we've argued it out amongst ourselves, and we haven't yet arrived at anything conclusive. We don't think it was a Met balloon, we don't think it was another aircraft.
You're pretty used to seeing those.
There's been quite a few.
Quite a few. Yeah. So what about your conclusions? You say you've drawn none. What did you think about this whole flying saucer story before you came across this one, or this event?
Well, up to this time, I was a confirmed skeptic, but now I think I have an open mind.
You're still open mind?
Just an open mind.
Flying Officer Terry Johnson and his navigator and radar operator Geoffrey Smythe, who laconically reported what they'd seen in their flight log, on which closer examination simply says, saucer day. So what did you see, guys? What was there in the sky that morning?
Well, it's a bright light, which I thought at first was a star or something, then realised it was much bigger. and as it came towards us, I suppose, it then appeared to be a circular disc or ring of light.
See, the documentary's made a kind of mock-up of what you actually saw. Is that how you remember it? That bright light there?
Not quite. It was a bright light, but it was circular, like a polar mint.
Well, actually,
shining bright.
Yes, a donut, really. So it had a sort of a gap in the middle, a gap in the centre?
Well, less or very little light in the middle, because it was so bright. It was, you know, about half the size of the moon, but at least 10 times the brightness of the moon. This was by day, by the way.
So you tapped Geoffrey on the shoulder and said, hey, look at this, because you were burying your head into the radar thing, weren't you? And
I was, yes.
And what did you see?
Well, nothing at first, nothing on the radar, strangely enough. But the radar was searching at horizontally, if you so wish. And this thing, whatever it was above the area that we were sweeping.
So it was out of your radar range at that point?
In terms of height, yes.
And did you see an object that conforms to what your co-pilot just said?
But very briefly, because by the time I saw it, it was disappearing, if you wish.
What do you mean? Was it just evaporating or moving away?
No, moving away.
Now, what's interesting about this story is that a few hours later, it wasn't on your radar, it was reported that an object in the same spot in the sky had been seen moving at tremendous speeds, I mean impossible speeds by our technological standards, and had disappeared. And your eyewitness report and that ground radar reporting turned this into headline news. This not, as we can see here from these old headlines, it wasn't just on the TV news, it was all over the papers for days at a time.
Yes.
And in the end, you sort of became laughingstocks, didn't you? People thought it was...
We had our legs pulled, yes.
You had your legs
quite
pulled.
a few times, yes.
And you were told
Saucer Johnson, then.
And you were told by the RAF to shut up.
I don't think we were
No,
told to
we
shut
were
up
not
too
told.
much,
Others
no.
were told to shut up.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually gave the permission to the BBC to come and film us at the first time to take those shots.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the media...
And then thought, oops, we
all
shouldn't have done
newspapers
that.
came on. Then, of course, there was the music hall and the gags, Razor Laugh, or whoever it was at the time. It was Norman Wisdom's peak.
Well, this is where I must bring you in, because also joining with us here is Dr. David Clark, who's a social historian from Sheffield University, who's been looking into the recently released X-Files and indeed takes part in that Time Watch documentary. Now, what's happened was that after this initial sort of, oh, let's send the BBC down and tell everyone about it, it occurred to people, sort of, if you like, the establishment and high-up authorities in this country that actually they ought to be keeping their trap shut. Why?
Well, they didn't like the publicity, the unwelcome publicity that these kinds of sightings were bringing, and it was...
Why was it unwelcome? I mean, it was interesting and strange, but why...
Well, this was a time when we were fighting the Cold War, and the government wanted people to think that we had control over the airspace of this country, and they didn't like the idea that things could possibly be intruding into that.
Also, they didn't, I think you say this in the programme tonight, they didn't like basically being in the dark because they didn't know what these things were.
Right.
And they were exposed really by these reports as being completely ignorant.
Exactly. Yeah, and it was only a couple of months after this sighting that a command was issued to all the RAF stations in the country, basically saying that any aircrew that sees anything unusual, not to speak to the press, to report it directly to Air Ministry, and that they were warned that, you know, possibly they could be action under the Official Secrets Act if they did break that rule.
But just very quickly, now we tend to look back and ufologists say, oh, cover up, cover up. It wasn't that. It was just as we've said. It was simply because they were embarrassed that they didn't know.
That's right. And I mean, everything was secret.
You agree, obviously.
It's a tradition of secrecy that we've always had.
Privately.
Yeah.
By one MP, George Ward.
What did he say?
The Under-Secretary of State was in one of the books that he said, well, to a leading reporter who was interviewing by whatever method. And he said, I know it's not balloons, you know it's not balloons, but I'm not allowed to say anything until a flying saucer lands in Hyde Park and we can charge £6.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist.
It went right to the top, didn't it? Because we have a copy, you in the documentary, have a copy of a note from Winston Churchill, no less, the Prime Minister. Can you see what that... Can you read that, Richard?
What does all this... hang on, let's
What's
go
all
close to
this
the screen.
stuff?
What does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? What is the truth? Let me have a report at your convenience. WSC. Wonderful.
And they had a flying saucer project, didn't they? They wanted to build one themselves.
When he asked that question, the answer that was given was that there'd been a full intelligence study the year before, which was the Flying Saucer Working Party, which had decided it was all nonsense and there was nothing to it.
Well, if we don't...
They had to revise that.
Yeah.
Well, if we don't know what they were, if we don't know what it was that you saw, it could have been... God knows. I mean, you must have a favourite theory in your mind. Do you think it was an alien spacecraft?
We don't have a theory, but we certainly know it was an unidentified or unexplained flying object.
But do you think it was a natural thing? Do you think it was like ball lightning of some kind, or do you think it was a mechanical device being piloted through the skies?
I think most of us agree that it was a mechanical device by definition through the skies.
So what did the Russians ever have flying saucers? I mean,
well, the Air Ministry was worried that the Russians perhaps had perfected some kind of high-tech flying object that could penetrate our air defences.
But that was never proved.
It was, well, it wasn't the case.
It wasn't the case.
But there were a lot of other possible explanations, such as high-altitude balloons. Ball lightning is another case you mentioned, and you know, there's lots of other possible explanations.
Yes, but the kind of objects that you saw, and I have to say we've also interviewed some civilian, well, a civilian pilot who flew for BA and in 1967 had an almost identical experience actually over the Bay of Biscay, except that he did have it on his radar, and it was also seen by French radar, and it's a matter of record. A silver disc heading towards him at something like 30,000 miles an hour, shot silently beneath the lower wing, about 50 feet below, and vanished over the horizon in a few seconds. And it was tracked on radar. So, all right, they didn't know then what they were. I know we don't know now what they were, but looking at all these records that are now tumbling out of the closet, all these old skeletons coming out now, what might we speculate? Was there perhaps a few years of intense UFO activity above the skies, or was it mass hysteria?
It seems that something unusual was going on, and they could not explain 100% of these sightings. There was always that little residue of about 5% left over, and that is the reason why they had to maintain this little office that monitored these sightings until today.
And just one final fascinating fact, that Prince Philip was absolutely obsessed with these things. He had an aquarium that he used to send every time. He didn't meet you. Did he meet you, this aquarium?
Prince Philip.
The
he was sent to Air Ministry to be interviewed by his secretary, who was a squadron leader at the time. No, perhaps the Duke's looking in now.
But also, didn't this guy, the aquarium, didn't he also meet with a strange and mysterious gentleman in a London flat called Mr. Janus?
That's right. Yes.
And the aquarium concluded that this guy was from another planet.
But you think it was MI5, didn't you?
I think that's a more straightforward
Trying to find out what Prince Philip knew or thought of, I'd say, in public. Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Some very strange people at the time, so...
Yeah, it's such good fun, actually. I mean, it really is.
Well, Dr. Clark's written a great book, actually, about all this, called Out of the Shadows, UFOs, the Establishment and the Official Cover-Up, but now we know the reasons behind that. And it's fascinating to meet two guys looking so well, I must say, after all these years. You flew vampires, did you?
Yeah, vampires. Yeah. Then onto meteors.
Onto meteors.
After that, yeah.
Do you still fly?
No, I gave up about 10 years ago, 15
Do you,
years
Geoffrey?
ago.
No?
I went on flying for many years, actually. He was only in the service for 2.5 minutes. I was in it for 34 years.
Cheeky boat.
What was your last plane? What was the last plane you flew?
Britannia.
Right. Well, thank you both very much. Thank you for